I am Zuri, 28 years old, and last Sunday, my family threw me out like garbage because I refused to abandon a terrified mute 6-year-old boy. As my father, a prominent bishop, screamed that I was a disgrace, and my brother-in-law mocked my bank account, I simply held the little boy's hand and walked out into the rain. They thought I was ruining my life for a street kid. They had no idea that the silent child trembling in my arms was the sole heir to a billion-dollar tech empire, or that his father was about to make them pay for every cruel word they spoke to me. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace. The smell of roasted lamb and sweet tea usually brought comfort, but tonight, the heavy oak dining table felt like a courtroom. My mother Valerie had pulled out her finest china with crystal glasses catching the light of the grand chandelier. She was hosting 2 city councilmen and a state senator, all to secure zoning permits for my father's latest megachurch expansion. The room was a fortress of wealth and false piety. I was supposed to sit quietly, wear a polite smile, and serve the food like the obedient daughter they always wanted me to be. Instead, I stood near the entryway, gripping the hand of a 6-year-old boy named Malik. His clothes were still damp from the rain, and he was staring at the marble floor, completely terrified. My father, Bishop Thomas, a man who preached charity and grace to thousands of devoted followers every Sunday, suddenly slammed a stack of papers onto the dining table. The loud smack made the crystal glasses rattle. The politicians shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but my father did not care. His face twisted into a scowl as he pointed a heavy gold-ringed finger directly at me. He demanded to know why I had brought a mute stray kid into his immaculate home, ruining a vital networking dinner. His voice boomed across the room, telling me I was out of my mind. He yelled that I could barely take care of myself, let alone drag some broken child off the streets to play savior. Malik squeezed my hand tighter, pressing his small body against my leg. He had not spoken a single word since I found him hiding behind a dumpster 3 days ago, bruised and terrified. He had not spoken a single word when the emergency room doctors examined his frail body. He had not spoken a single word as my father roared his insults across the dining room. The papers my father had just thrown on the table were the hospital intake forms I had filled out trying to get Malik basic care. My father had intercepted them in the mailroom and decided to make a public spectacle of my supposed incompetence to show his powerful guests that he ruled his household with an iron fist. Before I could even defend my actions, my brother-in-law, Brad, chimed in. Brad is a white investment banker who married my sister Chloe 3 years ago. He always carried this insufferable superiority complex, constantly lecturing our family on wealth management while sipping my father's expensive bourbon. Brad leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and let out a condescending chuckle. He looked me up and down, his eyes full of pity and absolute disgust. Zuri, you dropped out of Spelman College just to run a raggedy freelance public relations business, Brad sneered. His voice carried that familiar tone of mockery he reserved only for me. Your little event planning gigs barely pay your rent. You do not have the money to pay for a child. This boy needs intense therapy and premium health insurance, neither of which you possess. Do not burden the taxpayers with your impulsive decisions and stop embarrassing the family name. The sheer audacity of a white man sitting at my black father's table telling me I was a burden to society was infuriating. But what hurt more was watching my own family nod in agreement with every condescending word he spoke. Chloe, my older sister, sat next to Brad, inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. As a cosmetic surgeon and the undisputed golden child of the family, she never missed an opportunity to watch me fall. She chimed in, adding that my presence was exhausting and that my bleeding heart act was just a desperate plea for attention from parents who had rightfully given up on me. My mother Valerie adjusted her pearl necklace. She was a prominent member of a prestigious sorority, a woman whose entire existence revolved around social climbing and maintaining an illusion of absolute perfection. She looked at me like I was a stain on her immaculate white rug. She proudly announced to the guests that Chloe and Brad had just closed on a $2 million estate in Buckhead, proving they were the children bringing true honor to the family. She told me my choices were a disgrace. She said I had been a disappointment since the day I rejected my sorority legacy to become a freelancer. She told me, her voice dripping with venom, to look at myself playing mother to a street urchin. She swore she would not have her friends at the country club gossiping about this spectacle. She gave me an ultimatum right there in front of the uncomfortable politicians. I either had to turn the boy over to the state ward system immediately and beg for a monthly allowance from my father to cover my own rent, or I could walk out the front door and consider myself cut off from the family trust forever. They expected me to break. They expected me to drop the boy's hand and fall to my knees. I looked at the politicians who were staring intently at their plates, pretending not to hear the destruction of a family. I looked at Chloe, who was perfectly content to watch me burn. I looked at Brad, whose smug smile made my blood boil. I looked at my parents, who cared more about a zoning permit and country club gossip than a traumatized child seeking refuge from the cold. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of my pain. Crying would only give them the power they craved. Instead, I tightened my grip on Malik's small hand. He looked up at me with large, fearful eyes, silently pleading with me not to let him go. I knelt down, slightly smoothing his shirt and assuring him without words that he was safe with me. Then I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, and looked directly into my father's eyes. "I do not use a single dime of your church funds," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I certainly do not need a trust fund built on fake righteousness." I turned my back on the entire room and walked toward the heavy oak front door. As I reached for the handle, I heard Chloe laugh behind me, betting loudly to Brad that I would not last 3 days before coming back to beg for grocery money. I walked out into the cool evening air, closing the door firmly behind me, walking away in a chorus of their insults. The morning sun crept through the cracked blinds of my cramped apartment, casting pale lines across the worn carpet. I sat at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. My eyes were fixed on the small lump sleeping soundly on my faded sofa. Malik had not moved since his head hit the pillow. His tiny hands were still curled into fists even in his sleep. I pulled up my banking app on my cracked phone screen. $32.14. That was my entire safety net. My father and Brad were absolutely right about my financial reality, but they were entirely wrong about what it meant to be a provider. Being a protector did not require a Buckhead estate or a luxury vehicle. It required showing up. My family had never understood that distinction. The silence of the early morning was suddenly shattered by a violent pounding on my front door. The sheer force of the knocks made the cheap wood rattle in its frame. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was barely 7 in the morning. My first thought went straight to my father. Bishop Thomas was not a man who accepted defiance. He had the money and the influence to send the local police or child protective services to my door just to prove a point. He would gladly strip this boy away from me just to show his congregation that his rebellious daughter was an unfit menace to society. The pounding echoed again, louder this time, accompanied by heavy, muffled voices in the hallway. I stood up quickly, my chair scraping against the linoleum. I rushed to the narrow window and pulled back the edge of the blind. My breath caught in my throat. The street below my building, usually lined with rusted sedans and overflowing trash bins, was completely barricaded. A fleet of black armored SUVs idled in a perfect line. Men in tactical gear were stationed at the perimeter of the complex, pushing back a growing crowd of curious neighbors. "Open the door immediately!" a deep voice ordered from the hallway. I grabbed the heavy metal flashlight from my kitchen drawer, my knuckles turning white around the grip. I stepped in front of the sofa, placing my body between the door and the sleeping child. I unlocked the deadbolt but kept the chain engaged, opening the door just a fraction of an inch. Before I could even speak, a heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The metal chain snapped instantly, sending screws flying across the entryway. I stumbled backward, raising the flashlight as a swarm of large men in dark suits flooded into my tiny living room. They moved with terrifying precision, securing the corners of the room in seconds. One of the men rested his hand near a shoulder holster, his eyes darting, scanning for threats. Malik woke up with a start. He let out a silent gasp and scrambled off the sofa, darting behind me. He wrapped his small arms tightly around my legs, pressing his face into my pajamas. I held my ground, wrapping one arm protectively around his back while gripping the flashlight with my other hand. "Get out of my house," I yelled, my voice trembling but loud. "I will call the police." The wall of bodyguards suddenly parted. A man stepped through the doorway, and the entire energy in the room shifted. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and an undeniable presence of authority, but his appearance told a different story. He wore a custom-tailored suit that was deeply wrinkled. His tie was missing. The top buttons of his crisp white shirt were torn open. He looked like a man who had been walking through hell. When he raised his head, I saw his eyes. They were bloodshot, swollen, and frantic with a kind of raw desperation I had never seen before. I recognized him instantly. Elijah Pierce. He was the founder of a global technology empire, a billionaire whose face had graced the cover of every major business magazine in the country. My brother-in-law Brad had practically worshipped him, constantly quoting his investment strategies at family dinners. But right now, standing in my rundown apartment, Elijah Pierce did not look like a tech titan. He looked like a shattered man. His wild eyes scanned the room and instantly locked onto the small boy hiding behind my legs. The air rushed out of his lungs in a ragged gasp. "Malik," he choked out. The billionaire CEO did not hesitate. He dropped straight to his knees, hitting the cheap kitchen floor with a heavy thud. He ignored his security team. He ignored me. He reached out with trembling hands, tears spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his face. "My boy!" he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. "Please come here. Please." I felt the tension release from Malik's small body. The boy peeked out from behind my legs. For the first time in 3 days, his eyes widened with something other than sheer terror. He let go of my pants, took one hesitant step forward, and then broke into a run. He collided with his father, throwing his arms around Elijah's neck. Elijah let out a sound that was half laugh and half cry, burying his face in his son's shoulder. He wrapped his large arms around the boy, pulling him tight against his chest, rocking him back and forth on the floor. He repeatedly kissed the top of Malik's head, whispering prayers of gratitude into the quiet room. I lowered the flashlight, feeling the adrenaline drain from my muscles. I stepped back, giving them space, my own eyes filling with tears as I watched the profound display of pure, unconditional love. It was the exact kind of love my own father had withheld from me my entire life. After a long moment, Elijah slowly opened his eyes and looked up at me from the floor. He kept one arm firmly wrapped around his son. He explained, his voice raspy and thick with emotion, that Malik had been taken 3 days ago. It was a targeted ransom kidnapping orchestrated by a former security contractor who knew their routines. The kidnappers had held Malik in a warehouse across the city, but the boy had managed to slip away through an unlocked loading bay door when his captors were distracted. Malik had been wandering the harsh city streets alone, traumatized into absolute silence, until I found him shivering behind that diner dumpster. Elijah explained that his private security team had been tearing the city apart block by block. They had finally picked up a trail from a local clinic where I had attempted to get Malik examined using those very intake forms my father had mocked me for. They tracked the clinic's camera footage straight to my neighborhood. "You saved his life," Elijah said, his voice filled with a heavy, fierce gratitude as he slowly stood up, carrying Malik in his arms. "You protected my son when he had no one. You took him in when you had nothing. I do not know who you are, but I swear to you right now, your life will never be the same. I will make sure you never have to worry about a single thing for the rest of your days." Before I could even process his promise, a harsh vibration rattled against the kitchen counter. My phone was lighting up and buzzing violently. I glanced over at the screen. The caller ID flashed in bold letters. Bishop Thomas' father. My brow furrowed. He never called me on a weekday morning. He certainly never called me after disowning me. Then I realized what was happening. I looked toward the window. Above the sound of the idling SUVs in the street, I could hear the distinct rhythmic chopping of helicopter blades circling overhead. The local news stations had caught wind of the massive security breach in my neighborhood. The morning broadcasts were undoubtedly showing live footage of Elijah Pierce's heavily armored motorcade parked right outside my specific apartment building. My mother never missed the morning news. My father never missed an opportunity to monitor the city's wealthy elite. They had seen the broadcast. They had put the pieces together. They finally realized exactly who the mute stray kid actually was. They realized that the child they had thrown out into the rain, the child they had ordered me to hand over to the state, was the sole heir to a massive billion-dollar technology empire. The phone stopped buzzing for exactly 2 seconds before it started vibrating frantically again. Another call from my father, followed instantly by a text message notification from Chloe, demanding I pick up the phone immediately. They were panicked. They were desperate to backtrack. They suddenly wanted the daughter they had treated like human garbage just 12 hours earlier. Elijah watched me staring at the phone. "Is everything all right?" he asked, shifting Malik gently on his hip. I looked at the billionaire and his son. I looked at the life-changing promise standing right in front of me. Then I looked down at the flashing screen demanding my compliance one last time. I walked over to the counter. I picked up the phone feeling the frantic buzzing against my palm. I let a slow, genuine smile touch my lips. I pressed the red decline button, ending the call instantly. Without a second thought, I dropped the phone straight into the trash can. "Everything is perfect," I said, turning back to Elijah. "I am completely ready for the next chapter." He thought money was the answer. He thought money could balance the scales. He thought money could erase the trauma of the last 3 days. He clicked a silver pen and scrawled his signature across the bottom of a blank check. He tore it from the binding and held it out to me, his hand completely steady despite his bloodshot eyes. He told me to write down any number I wanted. He told me this was his debt to pay. He told me I would never have to live in a place like this again. I stared at the slip of paper. My father used money to control people. Brad used money to belittle people. Chloe used money to blind people. I reached out and took the check from Elijah's hand. Then, without breaking eye contact, I ripped it cleanly down the middle. I placed the torn pieces on my kitchen counter. "I run a business," I told him, my voice calm and unwavering. "I charge my clients for public relations strategies, event coordination, and brand management. But I do not charge a fee for basic human decency. I did not pull your son out of the freezing rain for a payout. I pulled him out of the rain because he was a child who needed someone to simply show up." Elijah stared at me. The billionaire, who was accustomed to everyone wanting a piece of his fortune, looked completely, entirely speechless. He looked at the torn pieces of the check, and then back at me, a profound respect replacing the frantic desperation in his eyes. He nodded slowly, acknowledging that he had misjudged my character. He signaled to the men standing by the door, indicating it was time to leave. He knelt back down and gently placed his hands on Malik's shoulders, telling him it was time to go home. The reaction was instant and violent. Malik let out a piercing shriek. He screamed when the lead bodyguard stepped forward to clear the path. He screamed when his father tried to lift him into his arms. He screamed until the walls of my tiny apartment seemed to shake with his absolute terror. The silence he had maintained for 3 days broke into a shattered, hysterical panic. His small hands clawed at Elijah's expensive shirt, fighting to get back to me. I dropped to my knees immediately. I pulled Malik against my chest, wrapping my arms tightly around his shaking frame. I rocked him back and forth against the cheap linoleum floor, murmuring quiet assurances until his screams dissolved into exhausted hiccups. I did not let go. I did not pull away. I did not stop rocking him. Elijah stood above us, helpless and heartbroken, watching his only son cling to a stranger for safety. "He will not survive being separated from you," Elijah said, his voice raw with defeat. "He has been through a nightmare, and you are the only anchor he recognizes." Elijah began pacing the narrow strip of floor between my kitchen counter and the front door. His mind was working rapidly, shifting from a desperate father to a calculating chief executive. He stopped and looked at me, reviewing the torn check and then my defiant posture. You said you run a public relations business. You handle brand management and crisis coordination. I nodded, keeping my arms firmly around Malik. My company is currently facing the greatest crisis in its history, Elijah stated, his tone shifting into absolute authority. The media is swarming. The board of directors is panicking. My internal public relations team is completely paralyzed by the kidnapping. I need someone who does not panic. I need someone who cannot be bought. I need someone who knows exactly how to stand their ground when the entire world is breaking down their door. He crouched down to my eye level. I am offering you the position of Director of Crisis Management for Pierce Industries. You will take over my entire communications department. You will also serve as Malik's personal psychological guardian until he feels safe again. You will live on my estate. You will have full executive authority. Name your salary and I will double it. It was a staggering proposition. It was an offer that would instantly obliterate the smug superiority of my entire family. I looked down at Malik, who had finally stopped trembling. I looked at Elijah, who was offering me the power and the platform I had worked my entire life to achieve. I accepted the offer. Within 2 hours, my meager belongings were packed into the back of a bulletproof luxury vehicle. We arrived at the Pierce estate, an architectural marvel of glass and steel isolated on hundreds of acres of private woodland. I was given a suite adjacent to Malik's room, an office overlooking the manicured grounds, and a security detail of my own. I was just sitting down at my new mahogany desk to review the company's press briefings when a junior executive knocked on my door. He was holding a tablet, his face pale with anxiety. He told me I needed to see the local news broadcast immediately. I took the tablet and tapped the screen. The video buffered for a second before revealing a highly orchestrated press conference taking place on the steps of my father's megachurch. Bishop Thomas stood at the podium dressed in his finest tailored suit, looking somber and deeply spiritual. My mother stood right beside him, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Chloe and Brad were positioned strategically in the background, looking appropriately solemn. My stomach turned as my father began to speak into the cluster of microphones. He used his deep, resonant preaching voice to weave a web of absolute lies. He announced to the city that it was his church, his spiritual guidance, and his family's unwavering charitable values that had rescued the young billionaire heir. We knew this child needed a sanctuary. My father lied into the cameras, his face a mask of false piety. I personally instructed my daughter to take the boy in to shelter him and to provide him with our family's signature grace. We recognized his distress, and we did what the Thomas family has always done. We sacrificed our own comfort to harbor the lost. We are simply grateful that our church's mission of charity could assist Mr. Pierce in his time of need. I stared at the screen as the reporters shouted questions about the church's heroics. He used my pain to secure his zoning permits. He used my name to generate a national soundbite. He used a traumatized, kidnapped child to launch a tax-deductible donation campaign for his ministry. The sheer depth of their hypocrisy was suffocating. They had thrown me into the street. They had called me a disgrace. They had threatened to cut me off for protecting the very child they were now using to boost their public profile. Elijah walked into my office. He had watched the broadcast on the monitors in the hallway. His jaw was tight with anger. He offered to have his elite legal team issue a cease and desist order immediately. He offered to have them shut my father down before the evening news cycle began. I placed the tablet face down on my desk. I stood up and smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at the man who had just handed me the keys to his empire's communications network. "No," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Do not call the lawyers. I am your director of crisis management. This is my first official assignment. My family wants the spotlight. My family wants the media attention. My family wants the world to see exactly who they are. I am going to give them exactly what they want. I am going to tear their pristine reputation apart piece by piece on national television. Let them enjoy the applause for now. The real show is just about to begin." 10 miles away, the atmosphere inside the Thomas estate was a stark contrast to their televised display of holy grace. The heavy oak doors of my father's private study were locked tight, shutting out the world. The local news was playing on mute on a flat screen in the corner, showing replay after replay of their fraudulent press conference. Brad poured himself a generous glass of my father's expensive bourbon, his hands trembling so violently that the amber liquid spilled onto the pristine Persian rug. Chloe sat on the edge of a leather sofa, her perfectly manicured fingers twisted into tight knots. The Buckhead estate she had bragged about just 48 hours ago was slipping through her fingers. Brad's investment firm was not just failing, it was hemorrhaging millions. He had over-leveraged a series of highly risky commercial real estate portfolios, and the banks were aggressively calling in his margins. He needed $5 million in cash by the end of the week, or the Securities and Exchange Commission would be knocking on his door investigating a string of fraudulent wire transfers he had used to cover his early losses. My mother, Valerie, paced the floor, her pearl necklace clinking rhythmically against her collarbone. She was not worried about Brad going to a federal prison. She was terrified of the country club gossip. A bankrupt, federally indicted son-in-law would destroy her immaculate social standing. She turned to my father, her voice sharp and demanding, insisting he fix the situation immediately. Bishop Thomas stood behind his grand mahogany desk, his face flushed with a dangerous mixture of rage and panic. He had just staked his entire pastoral reputation on national television, leveraging his supposed rescue of the Pierce heir to elevate his church's profile and secure his expansion permits. If his son-in-law was indicted for federal financial crimes, the resulting scandal would obliterate the church's massive development project and invite a deep, devastating audit of their own ministry finances. My father opened his personal laptop, his jaw set in a hard line. He bypassed his personal checking accounts and logged directly into the church's internal financial portal. He accessed the Sacred Charity Fund, specifically the account designated for the new community orphanage project. The sheer irony of stealing from orphans after threatening to send a traumatized child to the state ward system was completely lost on him. Without a single shred of hesitation or spiritual guilt, he initiated a blind wire transfer of $2 million straight into an offshore shell account controlled by Brad. He called it a temporary bridge loan. He justified the theft by claiming he was protecting the broader mission of the ministry. Brad downed the rest of his bourbon, his arrogant confidence artificially returning as he watched the digital transfer confirmation pop up on his phone. But $2 million was merely a band-aid over a gaping fatal wound. It would buy him exactly 3 days to appease his most aggressive creditors, but he still needed a massive legitimate capital injection to save his firm from total collapse. He slammed his glass onto the desk and announced his master plan: Pierce Industries. Brad explained to the room that Pierce Industries had a predatory venture capital division that aggressively funded distressed real estate portfolios. Normally, a firm in his disastrous condition would be rejected by their automated screening software within seconds. But Brad smugly reminded my parents that the Thomas family was no longer just a local church dynasty. They were now the heroic saviors of Elijah Pierce's only son. Brad intended to exploit that completely fabricated connection to the fullest extent. He planned to submit an emergency funding application and attach a personal letter referencing their family's selfless service to the Pierce bloodline. He fully expected the grieving, grateful billionaire to approve the massive bailout out of sheer guilt and public obligation. My father nodded in agreement, praising Brad's ruthless ingenuity. Chloe finally relaxed her shoulders, dropping as she began calculating how many designer bags she could buy once the Pierce money hit their joint accounts. Brad sat down at my father's desk, pulled out his sleek laptop, and confidently hit send on the digital dossier. He leaned back in the leather chair, a smug smile stretching across his face. He believed he was outsmarting the global financial system. He believed he was manipulating a vulnerable billionaire. He had absolutely no idea where that email was actually going. Back at the Pierce estate, I sat in my new corner office tracing the rim of a bone china coffee cup. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the junior executive from earlier stepped inside. He carried a single sleek black folder. He placed it carefully on the center of my desk, explaining that the venture capital division had just received an emergency priority funding request. The internal security system had automatically flagged the application because the sender had explicitly referenced a personal connection to Mr. Pierce and the recent kidnapping incident. The executive asked if I wanted the legal department to discard it as opportunistic spam. I opened the folder. The name Bradley Vance stared back at me in bold corporate lettering. Attached was a sickeningly sweet cover letter mentioning the Thomas family's continuous prayers for Malik and subtly demanding a $10 million capital injection as a gesture of mutual partnership and shared family values. I read the detailed financial breakdowns, the desperate plea for liquidity, and the outright lies about his firm's stability. I looked up at the junior executive and told him to cancel all my afternoon meetings. I told him to bypass the standard review board, to authorize the initial due diligence phase, and to grant Brad a preliminary approval notification. The junior executive looked confused by the rapid approval for such a distressed asset, but he nodded respectfully and backed out of the room. I closed the black folder and leaned back in my chair. Brad wanted Pierce Industries to save his life. Instead, he had just willingly handed me the exact financial weapon I needed to bury him and my father in the same shallow grave. 2 days later, the suffocating walls of my old life felt like a distant memory. Elijah had insisted that Malik needed safe, controlled exposure to the outside world to begin healing from his severe trauma. He handed me a solid black corporate American Express card and told me to spare absolutely no expense in making his son feel secure again. I chose the Sterling Club, an ultra-exclusive members-only dining room located in the highest echelon of the financial district. It was the exact kind of establishment where membership required a six-figure initiation fee, a rigorous board approval process, and a generational pedigree. I walked through the heavy gold-plated glass doors, wearing a tailored emerald green Alexander McQueen suit that commanded instant, unwavering respect from the staff. Malik held my hand, tightly matching my elegance in a custom-fitted navy blazer and pristine leather loafers. The maitre d' greeted me by name, instantly recognizing the Pierce Industries corporate account attached to my reservation. He ushered us past the crowded main floor to a secluded corner booth surrounded by tinted glass partitions and lush velvet seating, ensuring absolute privacy. For the first hour, everything was peaceful. Malik was actually smiling, dipping artisan truffle fries into organic ketchup and pointing at the massive cascading water wall in the center of the dining room. I watched the healthy color return to his cheeks, feeling a fierce protective warmth blooming in my chest. I was sipping a sparkling mineral water, finally feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Then the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant swung open, and the air in the room seemed to curdle. Chloe and Brad marched into the dining room. They were loud, demanding, and dripping in the kind of forced arrogance that always accompanied their hidden financial panic. Chloe was wearing a season-old Chanel dress, her eyes darting aggressively around the room to see exactly who was watching them. Brad looked completely disheveled. His tie was loosened, his face was slightly flushed, and he was loudly arguing with the hostess about their table placement. I watched in quiet amusement as Brad aggressively slapped a platinum credit card onto the host stand to secure a better table, completely unaware that the card was likely one declined transaction away from being confiscated by the bank. I kept my head turned, focusing entirely on Malik, but Chloe's predatory radar was always actively scanning for prey. She spotted me across the dining room. I saw her tap Brad's arm, pointing a sharp, manicured finger in my direction. Her jaw dropped in genuine shock at my attire and my location. Brad's chest puffed out immediately. He adjusted his wrinkled jacket, plastering on his signature smug smirk, and strode purposefully across the plush carpet toward our private booth. Chloe trailed closely behind him, practically salivating at the chance to publicly humiliate me in a high society setting. They bypassed the privacy partitions without an ounce of respect. "Well, look what the cat dragged into the elite sector," Brad announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to turn the heads of the neighboring wealthy patrons. I did not flinch. I carefully wiped Malik's hands with a linen napkin before slowly looking up at my brother-in-law. I noted the faint beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead. I noted the slight tremor in his hands. The man was drowning in a multi-million-dollar debt and using loud aggression as a pathetic life preserver. Are you lost, Zuri? Chloe chimed in, leaning heavily against the velvet booth with a mocking laugh. This is not exactly your local corner diner. Did you have to empty your entire sad little savings account just to buy a glass of tap water here? Brad looked down at Malik, then back up at my expensive tailored suit. His brain, fueled by years of deeply ingrained prejudice and racial superiority, completely miscalculated the reality of the situation. He let out a loud, condescending bark of laughter. "Oh, I get it now," Brad sneered, leaning aggressively over the table. "You actually managed to parlay your little rainy night stunt into a minimum wage job. The mighty Pierce family felt sorry for you and threw you a bone. What is your official title, Zuri? Glorified babysitter? Premium diaper changer? Are they letting you wear their old designer clothes to make you look presentable in public, so you do not embarrass them?" Malik shrank back against the velvet cushions, sensing the hostile, frantic energy radiating from the man looming over us. I calmly placed my hand over Malik's small fingers, silently reassuring him that he was perfectly safe. I looked directly into Brad's bloodshot eyes, refusing to break eye contact or show a single ounce of intimidation. "I am working directly for Pierce Industries," I replied, my voice incredibly low and steady. Brad chuckled, shaking his head as if I had just told a hilarious joke. "Sure you are. You are a hired nanny fetching organic juice boxes for the billionaire's kid. But you know what, Zuri? I am actually a generous guy. I believe in helping out the struggling working class." He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, glossy folder. It was a physical copy of the exact same desperate investment portfolio he had blindly emailed to my division the day before. He tossed it onto the pristine white tablecloth right next to my coffee cup. "I have a multi-million-dollar pitch sitting in the venture capital queue at Pierce Industries," Brad said, leaning closer, his breath smelling faintly of morning alcohol and sheer panic. "But corporate bureaucracy is far too slow for my timeline. Since you are wandering around the Pierce building playing nanny, you must know some of the staff. Maybe a janitor, maybe a low-level mailroom clerk. Slip this physical portfolio to someone on the inside. Get it onto a real executive's desk." Chloe crossed her arms, rolling her eyes at her husband. "Brad, why are you wasting your valuable time with her? She does not know anyone important. She is a glorified maid." Brad ignored her, reaching into his tailored pocket and pulling out a silver money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills and dropped them onto the table right next to his glowing portfolio. He patted my shoulder with heavy, patronizing force. "Do this little favor for me, Zuri, and you can keep the cash," Brad mocked, tapping the crisp bills. "Consider it a charitable family donation. It should help cover the rent for your raggedy little apartment this month, since I know your public relations business is practically bankrupt." I looked at the 5 crumpled bills resting on the white linen. I looked at the glossy portfolio detailing a failing firm that was currently being evaluated by my own internal security team. Then I looked at Brad. He was so blindingly arrogant, so completely consumed by his own false narrative of superiority, that he could not even fathom the idea of a black woman holding a position of supreme authority over his entire financial existence. He thought I was begging for scraps, while I was actually holding the keys to his complete destruction. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy portfolio. I let the $500 sit completely untouched on the table. "I will make sure this gets exactly where it belongs," I said, my voice dangerously smooth. "I will personally review every single page of this portfolio, Brad." Brad let out a roaring laugh, genuinely amused by my statement. He shook his head, finding the idea of a nanny reviewing his complex financial documents absolutely hysterical. "You do that, Zuri?" He chuckled, turning away from the table. "You read the big words and then pass it along to the adults in the boardroom. Try not to spill baby formula on it." Chloe gave me one final look of utter disgust before turning on her heel and following her husband back across the dining room. They strutted toward the bar, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. They had no idea that the woman they just mocked was the newly appointed Director of Crisis Management. They had no idea that I controlled the Pierce Venture Capital Vault. And they certainly had no idea that I was going to use that portfolio to systematically trigger a federal investigation that would strip them of every stolen dime they possessed. The executive boardroom at Pierce Industries occupied the entire top floor of the glass skyscraper. It was a space designed to intimidate, featuring a massive obsidian table, panoramic views of the city, and air conditioning so cold it felt like walking into a vault. I stood at the head of the table adjusting the lapels of my suit. 12 of the most powerful financial directors in the country sat before me alongside Elijah Pierce, who watched me with quiet, intense anticipation. They were accustomed to seeing brilliant analysts fold under the pressure of this room. I was not a standard analyst. I was a woman who had just spent her entire life surviving a family of narcissists, and I was currently holding a loaded gun aimed directly at their glass house. I dimmed the lights and pressed the remote in my hand. The massive presentation screen behind me illuminated, displaying the glossy cover of Bradley Vance's investment portfolio. A few of the directors shifted in their Italian leather chairs, murmuring in quiet recognition of the firm's name. Brad had spent years throwing expensive parties and renting luxury cars to create the illusion of a thriving financial empire. It was time to pull back the curtain. Gentlemen, I began, my voice ringing clear and steady across the silent room. Yesterday, our venture capital division received an emergency request for a $10 million capital injection from Vance Capital. The applicant attempted to bypass standard vetting protocols by claiming a personal connection to Mr. Pierce and referencing the recent security incident involving his son. He framed this request as a mutual partnership. I clicked the remote. The screen shifted from Brad's polished marketing materials to a stark spreadsheet filled with aggressive red text. I spent the last 12 hours running a surgical forensic audit on this portfolio. I continued, pacing slowly behind my chair. Bradley Vance is not offering a partnership. He is begging for a life raft. His entire commercial real estate portfolio is catastrophically over-leveraged. He has been using new investor capital to pay the margins on his failing properties. It is a classic textbook Ponzi structure, and it is currently collapsing in real time. One of the senior directors, a silver-haired man with a sharp scowl, leaned forward. That is a heavy accusation, Miss Thomas. Vance Capital has consistently reported solid quarterly earnings. They are reporting fabricated numbers, I countered, instantly, bringing up the next slide. Look at the asset valuations. He is claiming ownership of 3 prime commercial sectors in the downtown district. I pulled the actual municipal property deeds this morning. He does not own them. He holds minority equity in heavily mortgaged shell corporations. If you look at page 4 of his liquidity report, he claims to have a massive cash reserve to cover operational costs. I clicked the remote one more time. A bank routing statement appeared on the screen highlighting a very specific recent transaction. This cash reserve did not exist 48 hours ago, I stated, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. Exactly $2 million was wired into Vance Capital's primary holding account yesterday afternoon. I traced the routing numbers. This was not a legitimate return on investment. It was a blind transfer originating from a tax-exempt religious charity fund. He is stealing from a church ministry to hide his margin calls from federal regulators. If Pierce Industries injects $10 million into this firm, we will not be securing a profitable asset. We will be directly funding a federal financial crime. The boardroom went completely dead silent. The senior directors stared at the screen, their initial skepticism entirely replaced by absolute shock. They looked at the undeniable digital paper trail I had laid out before them. I had completely dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud in less than 5 minutes. Elijah Pierce slowly stood up from his chair at the center of the table. He did not look at the board of directors. He looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of profound respect and lethal corporate anger. The fact that Brad had tried to use Malik's traumatic kidnapping as leverage to steal Pierce money had ignited a quiet, terrifying rage inside the billionaire. Elijah placed his hands flat on the obsidian table. "You have extraordinary instincts, Zuri," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You saw exactly what my automated risk algorithms missed. This firm is a complete liability, and the man running it is a parasite. Elijah turned to look at the rest of the board. From this moment forward, Zuri Thomas has absolute total executive authority over this specific funding application and any future crisis interventions. She does not need board approval. Her decision is final. He looked back at me, giving a sharp, definitive nod. Handle it. I picked up the physical copy of Brad's portfolio from the table. I grabbed a thick red permanent marker from the supply tray. I did not use a digital signature or a polite corporate decline template. I opened the folder to the executive summary where Brad had arrogantly listed his demands. I pressed the red marker against the heavy cardstock and wrote 2 words in massive bold letters right across his fraudulent numbers. Rejected, blacklisted. I closed the folder and handed it to the senior legal counsel sitting to my right. Send a scanned copy of this rejection directly to Bradley Vance. I instructed, my tone completely devoid of emotion. Then package every single piece of forensic evidence I just presented and forward it immediately to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Let the federal agents sort out the rest. 10 miles away across the city, Brad was sitting in his leased luxury office overlooking the financial district. His expensive mahogany desk was cluttered with past due notices and aggressive letters from collection agencies. He was sweating profusely through his tailored shirt. He kept refreshing his email inbox every 30 seconds, his leg bouncing nervously against the floorboards. He had convinced Chloe and my father that the Pierce money was guaranteed. He had promised them that his genius manipulation of the kidnapping incident would secure the $10 million by the end of the day. His computer chimed. An email notification popped up on the screen. The sender address was registered to the executive branch of Pierce Industries. Brad let out a massive sigh of relief, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He clicked the email, expecting to see a term sheet and a wire transfer confirmation. Instead, his eyes landed on a scanned PDF attachment. He opened the file. The blood instantly drained from his face. Staring back at him was his own executive summary, completely defaced by thick red ink. Rejected. Blacklisted. His eyes darted down to the text of the email, reading the formal corporate notice. The message stated that Pierce Industries had conducted a comprehensive forensic audit, uncovering severe financial discrepancies and unauthorized charity fund transfers. The email ended with a final devastating sentence. This review was personally authorized and executed by Zuri Thomas, Director of Crisis Management. All findings have been forwarded to the appropriate federal regulatory authorities. Brad stopped breathing. The screen seemed to swim in front of him. Zuri, the woman he had just mocked at the restaurant. The woman he had offered $500 to act as a messenger. She was the executive director. She was the one who held the power. She was the one who had just signed his financial death warrant. A primal, panicked scream erupted from Brad's throat. He grabbed his crystal whiskey decanter from the side table and hurled it violently across the room. It shattered against the wall, sending sharp shards of glass and amber liquid raining down onto the expensive carpet. He swept his arm across his desk, knocking his dual monitors, his keyboard, and his framed awards crashing to the floor. He was completely trapped. The SEC would be auditing his accounts within days. They would find the fake valuations. They would find the shell companies. Most importantly, they would find the $2 million he had just stolen from the church. He was going to federal prison. Brad dropped to his knees amid the shattered glass and ruined electronics. His arrogance was completely gone, replaced by raw, suffocating terror. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He scrolled to his recent contacts and tapped my father's name. The phone rang 3 times before Bishop Thomas answered. "Listen to me!" Brad gasped, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. Pierce rejected the deal. They audited the firm. They know about the offshore accounts, and they know about the money from the church. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" My father demanded his pastoral calm, completely vanishing. You said the transfer was untraceable. You said Pierce was a guaranteed payout. It was Zuri, Brad screamed, clutching the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Zuri is running their executive division. She pulled our files and she reported the discrepancies to the federal regulators. They are going to audit my firm, and then they are going straight for your ministry accounts. My father was completely silent. The terrifying reality of the situation was settling over him. His golden son-in-law had just dragged his megachurch into a massive federal fraud investigation orchestrated entirely by the daughter he had cast out into the street. "I need more cash," Brad begged, crawling across the ruined floor of his office. "The $2 million is not enough to cover the margins anymore. The banks are going to freeze my accounts by morning. You have to drain the entire community orphanage fund. You have to wire me everything the church has right now, or I swear to God, I will tell the feds exactly who authorized that first transfer. You are going down with me, Bishop. I need that money right now." My private cell phone began to vibrate across the polished surface of my mahogany desk, exactly 40 minutes after I issued the blacklisting order against Bradley Vance. I was sipping a fresh cup of espresso, watching the digital confirmation from the Securities and Exchange Commission hit my secure inbox. The federal agents had officially received the forensic audit. The trap had violently snapped shut. I glanced down at my vibrating phone. The caller ID flashed a name I had not seen on my screen since the night I was thrown out into the freezing rain. Valerie Thomas. My mother. I let it ring 3 times. I sat back in my leather executive chair listening to the rhythmic buzzing, analyzing the precise timing of this sudden contact. Brad had undoubtedly called my father in a state of absolute hysteria, demanding more stolen charity funds to cover his collapsing fraudulent empire. My father, a man who operated entirely on public perception and financial leverage, was now staring down the barrel of a federal indictment by association. They were hemorrhaging cash. They were desperate, and my mother only ever called when she needed to extract value from a situation. I tapped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Zuri, darling," my mother sang through the receiver. Her voice was dripping with that thick, practiced syrup she exclusively reserved for wealthy church donors and local politicians. It was a tone completely devoid of maternal warmth, engineered entirely for manipulation. "I have been thinking about you all morning. We have all just been so incredibly worried about you since you left the house." "I did not leave." I corrected my voice, a flat, emotionless calm. "You and Bishop Thomas threw me out into a thunderstorm because I refused to abandon a traumatized child to the state ward system." My mother let out a high, breathy laugh, completely ignoring my statement, as if I had merely commented on the weather. "Oh, do not be so dramatic, Zuri. You have always had such a flair for the theatrical. Families have disagreements. It is perfectly natural. But we are a family of faith, and it is time to put these petty little misunderstandings behind us." I remained silent, allowing her false magnanimity to hang awkwardly in the air. The desperation was practically radiating through the cellular connection. "As you know, this Saturday is the grand 40th anniversary gala for our ministry." My mother continued, her pace quickening slightly when I refused to offer her the polite validation she expected. "It is going to be the most magnificent event of the decade. The mayor is attending. The city council will be there. We are transforming the entire fellowship hall into a ballroom to celebrate your father's glorious legacy of community service. And as a family, we expect you to be standing right there in the front row." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool obsidian desk. I knew exactly what the anniversary gala was designed to do. It was a massive high society shakedown. My parents used the opulent celebration to pressure their wealthiest congregants into writing massive tax-deductible checks for their various phantom community projects. Now, with Brad draining their accounts blind to cover his fraudulent margin calls, they needed a record-breaking night of donations just to keep the church doors open. "I appreciate the sudden invitation," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "But high society galas require a certain standard of presentation. I would hate to ruin your aesthetic." My mother seized the opening immediately, her voice dropping into a sharp, condescending whisper. That is exactly why I am calling you ahead of time, Zuri. I know how you struggle with appropriate evening wear on your meager little budget. I cannot have you showing up in one of your worn-out business suits, looking like a vagrant next to Chloe. So I went ahead and took care of it for you. I ordered a dress from that cheap little discount rack boutique you used to frequent in college. It is nothing special, but it is presentable enough for the back of the room. I will have one of the church volunteers drop it off at the Pierce Estate service entrance this afternoon. I looked down at the sleeves of my custom-tailored Alexander McQueen jacket. I looked around my sprawling corner office overlooking the financial district. The sheer blinding arrogance of her assumption was almost breathtaking. She truly believed I was scrubbing floors and washing dishes in a billionaire's mansion. She needed to diminish me. She needed to assert her dominance by wrapping an insult in a supposed act of charity. I understand, I said, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. You bought me a discount dress. But why the sudden urgency to have your disgraced daughter at your prestige event? Because you are not coming alone? My mother snapped, her patience finally wearing thin. You are going to bring Mr. Pierce. The entire congregation has been buzzing ever since your father heroically rescued his boy. Everyone knows you are living on his estate, working as his domestic help now. It is perfectly fine, honest labor, Zuri. There is no shame in being a maid for a wealthy family. But we need him in that building. The pieces of their desperate puzzle locked seamlessly into place. I need Mr. Pierce to be photographed. Shaking your father's hand at the gala, my mother continued spelling out her parasitic strategy. I need the wealthy donors to see the great tech billionaire endorsing our charity funds. If Elijah Pierce writes a check, our congregation will blindly match it tenfold. You live in his house, you take care of his child. Tell him it is a requirement of your employment. Tell him he owes the Thomas family for our holy intervention. Just get him to walk through those doors and sit at our VIP table. It was a brilliant, albeit entirely delusional, piece of crisis management. My parents were attempting to use the illusion of a partnership with Pierce Industries to trigger a tidal wave of donations to instantly replace the millions my father had illegally wired to Brad. They were trying to use Elijah Pierce as a human shield against their own impending financial ruin, and they believed I, the lowly hired nanny, was going to blindly lead him right into their trap. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting on my desk, rolling it slowly between my fingers. I thought about the discount polyester dress she was sending to the service entrance. I thought about Chloe and Brad aggressively parading their stolen wealth. I thought about my father standing at his pulpit preaching about grace while committing federal wire fraud. I will attend the gala, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a sharp metallic edge. And I will ensure that the Pierce estate is properly represented at your VIP table. Oh, wonderful. My mother exhaled a massive rush of relief, washing away her condescending edge. Just wear the dress I send you, Zuri. Stay quiet, keep your head down, and let your father do the talking when the cameras flash. There is just one specific protocol we must follow, I interrupted, cutting her off completely. Pierce Industries requires strict security clearances for all public appearances. You cannot just write his name on a piece of cardboard. I need you to send a formal gold-embossed VIP invitation directly to the executive headquarters. Of course, my mother agreed eagerly, already mentally counting the incoming donations. I will have it messaged over today. How exactly should I address the envelope to ensure it bypasses his secretaries? Address it to the senior partner of Pierce Industries. I instructed, my gaze fixed on the flashing stock ticker on my computer monitor. Do not use a personal name, just the official title. Send it to the executive suite. I will personally guarantee that the senior partner attends your father's anniversary gala. Perfect. My mother purred, her arrogant confidence completely restored. See, Zuri, when you actually follow instructions, you can be somewhat useful to this family. Do not be late on Saturday. She terminated the call without another word. I slowly lowered the phone, placing it face down on the polished wood. A slow, genuine smile touched my lips. My mother was so consumed by her own prejudice and so blinded by her desperation to save Brad's collapsing firm that she had not bothered to ask a single qualifying question. She was going to proudly send a VIP invitation to the senior partner of Pierce Industries, expecting a grateful, oblivious billionaire to walk through her doors and save her husband's church. She had absolutely no idea that the official title of senior partner belonged entirely exclusively and legally to me. And I was going to use that formal invitation to burn her magnificent gala straight to the ground. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The city stretched out below me, a glittering grid of power and commerce. My mother had just unknowingly handed me the exact coordinates to strike. She believed she was summoning a docile servant to fetch a billionaire for her ultimate social triumph. But I needed more than just a ruined funding pitch to completely dismantle their empire. I needed to pull their entire financial foundation out by the roots so they could never ever rebuild. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the single button that connected me directly to the chief of Pierce Industries' corporate intelligence division. I did not ask for a standard background check. I ordered a full, unrestricted forensic deep dive into the Thomas Family Trust, the ministry's operational accounts, and Bradley Vance's personal asset ledger. I authorized the intelligence team to bypass standard privacy protocols and utilize the absolute maximum extent of our corporate reach. I gave them unrestricted access to my executive budget and a hard deadline of 24 hours. The next morning, a heavily encrypted tablet was delivered to my desk by a bonded corporate security courier. I swiped my access badge and watched as the immaculate holy facade of Bishop Thomas and his golden family shattered into a million pieces of undeniable digital evidence. The intelligence team had unearthed secrets so dark and so desperately guarded that the sheer scale of their hypocrisy made my blood run cold. I opened the first file dedicated to my sister. Chloe's perfect suburban fairy tale was a complete and utter illusion. The sprawling Buckhead estate she constantly weaponized against me, comparing it to my cramped apartment, was deeply, desperately underwater. The forensic accountants had tracked a long history of missed payments. She was currently 120 days delinquent on the primary mortgage. The bank had already initiated internal foreclosure proceedings. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicles, her exclusive country club memberships were all entirely financed by a mountain of high-interest credit card debt that was currently sitting in active collection status. She was functionally bankrupt, spending her days pretending to be royalty while dodging calls from aggressive creditors. I swiped to the second file. Brad's situation was significantly darker than simple corporate incompetence. He was not just running a standard commercial Ponzi scheme among high-rolling investors. The internal bank routing logs proved he was specifically actively targeting the most vulnerable members of my father's congregation. Brad had used his position as the bishop's son-in-law to host private financial seminars in the church fellowship hall. He had systematically drained the retirement funds and fixed pension accounts of elderly widows and devoted lifelong churchgoers, promising them wholly guaranteed returns on their investments. He was stealing their life savings simply to pay his commercial margin calls and fund Chloe's fake lifestyle. But the most devastating file belonged to Bishop Thomas. The $2 million wire transfer he had executed yesterday was not an isolated incident born out of sudden panic. It was a well-established pattern of predatory behavior. Over the last 5 years, my father had systematically siphoned exactly $1.5 million from the church's community outreach program, the food pantry budget, and the youth sanctuary fund. He had created dummy vendor accounts to funnel tax-exempt charity money directly into offshore shell corporations. He used the stolen funds to finance his luxury cars, my mother's extensive cosmetic procedures, and the down payment on Chloe's lavish wedding. He was a ruthless predator, hiding safely behind a pulpit, demanding weekly tithes from families who could barely afford groceries. I printed the most damning ledgers, compiling them into a thick black binder. I carried the heavy volume down the executive hallway to Elijah's private suite. I bypassed his administrative staff, recognizing the security detail, who simply nodded and opened the double doors for me. Elijah was sitting on the floor near the window, helping Malik build a massive, intricate tower out of interlocking wooden blocks. Malik looked up and offered me a small, genuine smile, a beautiful, sharp contrast to the terrified, silent child I had rescued just days ago. I sat down at Elijah's glass conference table and opened the binder. Elijah instructed his security team to give us the room before joining me at the table. I walked him through the numbers line by devastating line. I showed him the names of the elderly parishioners who had lost their entire life savings to Brad. I showed him the orphanage funds deliberately diverted to pay for my mother's designer handbags. I watched the temperature in the room drop as Elijah's eyes scanned the irrefutable documents. His jaw tightened in absolute disgust. The man who had built his empire on innovation and strict loyalty possessed a lethal hatred for those who exploited the defenseless. He looked at me, his voice deadly quiet, asking if I wanted him to hand the files over to the federal prosecutor immediately to have them arrested before the end of the day. I shook my head, closing the binder with a sharp snap. A federal indictment would immediately freeze their assets and drag this out in the courts for years. I explained, my voice perfectly level. They would use the media to play the victim. My father would stand on his pulpit and claim religious persecution. My mother would cry on daytime television. I do not want them to go to a white-collar prison while pretending to be spiritual martyrs. I want them to lose everything they value in front of the exact people they have spent decades trying to impress. I laid out my strategy. I asked Elijah to authorize the Pierce Industries Aggressive Acquisitions Department to move immediately. I did not want to simply expose their massive debts to the public. I wanted to physically own those debts. I instructed his financial black ops team to quietly approach Brad's desperate creditors and purchase his toxic commercial portfolios at a premium. I told them to contact the bank holding the mortgage on my parents' sprawling estate and the bank preparing to foreclose on Chloe's mansion and buy the paper outright. Elijah did not hesitate for a single second. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, fully appreciating the absolute ruthlessness of my plan. He walked to his desk, picked up his secure phone, and authorized a blind, multi-million-dollar acquisition budget without asking a single follow-up question. He gave the acquisitions team exactly 48 hours to execute the sweep and secure every signature. The corporate machinery of Pierce Industries moved with terrifying lethal efficiency. 2 days later, a senior acquisitions attorney walked into my office and placed a thick stack of certified legal documents directly onto my desk. I ran my fingers over the heavy embossed paper. The predatory commercial loans, the active foreclosure, notices, the primary deeds to their properties. They were no longer held by faceless banking institutions or distant mortgage lenders. Pierce Industries had structured the incredibly aggressive buyouts through a newly established private holding corporation. It was a corporation that was legally registered entirely, completely, and exclusively in my name. I picked up the deed to the mega church property and the title to the Buckhead estate. My family had spent my entire life reminding me that I had nothing, that I was nothing. They had thrown me out into the cold because they believed they held all the power. Now, sitting in a glass tower above the city, I owned the roof over my parents' heads. I owned the very walls of Chloe's mansion. I owned every single cent of Brad's future. The net was perfectly, inescapably set. All I had to do now was put on my mother's discount dress and walk into their magnificent anniversary gala. I stared at the legal documents until the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting long, fractured shadows across my office. The trap was set. The net was woven. I packed the deeds into my leather briefcase and headed back to the Pierce estate. Saturday evening arrived with a chilling calm. I stood in the center of my expansive suite at the Pierce mansion, looking at the garment bag a church volunteer had dropped off at the service entrance, exactly as my mother had promised. I unzipped the plastic. It was a shapeless, dull gray polyester dress. It smelled of mass manufacturing and petty vindictiveness. It was designed to make me invisible. It was designed to make me look like a servant. It was the physical manifestation of my mother's absolute disdain. I slipped it on. I smoothed the cheap fabric over my ribs. I looked in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I did not see a victim. I saw an executioner in disguise. I was a woman holding the deeds to their entire existence, wearing their insult like a suit of armor. A soft, deliberate knock echoed through the suite. The heavy oak door swung open, and Elijah stepped into the room. He wore a tailored midnight black tuxedo that radiated absolute, undisputed authority. He stopped. He looked at the gray dress. He looked at the fierce, unyielding expression on my face. He understood instantly. He understood the psychological warfare my mother was attempting to wage, and he understood exactly how we were going to obliterate it. He walked slowly toward me, holding a flat velvet box in his hands. He did not ask about the dress. He did not question the strategy. He simply opened the box. Resting on the dark satin was a breathtaking necklace of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds, paired with matching cascading teardrop earrings. If you are going to walk into a war zone, you will wear the spoils of your victory. Elijah said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. He stepped behind me. He fastened the heavy, ice-cold diamonds around my neck. He attached the earrings. The cheap gray polyester suddenly transformed under the blinding, aggressive weight of the jewels. The contrast was jarring, intimidating, and undeniably powerful. It was no longer a servant's uniform. It was a canvas for pure, untouchable wealth. He turned me around. He looked into my eyes, not with the calculated gaze of a billionaire CEO, but with the profound, grounding intensity of a man who had finally found his equal. We had spent the last month fighting battles in boardrooms. We had spent the last month fighting nightmares in Malik's bedroom. We had fought the darkness together. We had built a sanctuary together. You saved my son. Elijah whispered, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. You dismantled an empire to protect this family. You did not just survive your past, Zuri. You conquered it. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a smaller velvet box. He did not kneel. Kneeling was for people begging for a favor. He stood perfectly straight at eye level, offering a partnership of absolute equals. He opened the small box, revealing a massive emerald-cut diamond ring that caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 brilliant shards. I do not want you just as my director of crisis management, Elijah said, his gaze locked onto mine. I do not want you just as the senior partner holding the keys to my vault. I want you as my wife. I want you as my equal. Build an empire with me, Zuri. Before I could process the massive brilliant diamond resting in the box, a small sound broke the heavy silence of the room. We both turned. Malik was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a tiny, perfectly tailored tuxedo that matched his father's exactly. His dark eyes were bright, clear, and completely free of the terror that had haunted him for weeks. The night terrors were gone. The haunting silence was gone. The trauma had been systematically washed away by the relentless, fierce protection we had wrapped around him day and night. Malik took a step forward. He looked at Elijah. He looked at me. His small hands gripped the edge of the doorframe. He opened his mouth. A sound he had not made since the night of the violent kidnapping finally broke free. Mama. It was a single word. It was a quiet word. But it struck me with the force of a physical blow. The breath completely left my lungs. The tears I had fiercely refused to shed for my biological family instantly rushed to my eyes for the family I had actively chosen. I dropped to my knees instantly, not caring about the gray dress, not caring about the heavy diamonds. I pulled Malik into my arms, burying my face in his small, warm shoulder. He wrapped his arms tightly around my neck, holding on with a fierce, absolute trust that healed every broken piece of my soul. Elijah knelt beside us, wrapping his massive arms around both of us, sealing the three of us in an unbreakable circle of warmth and unyielding loyalty. Yes, I whispered, looking up at Elijah through my tears, my hand resting firmly against Malik's back. Yes, to all of it. Elijah kissed my forehead, helping me back to my feet. He slid the heavy diamond ring onto my finger. It was cold. It was perfect. It was a promise of total destruction to anyone who dared to cross us. I wiped my eyes, clearing away the last traces of vulnerability. I smoothed the gray fabric of my mother's insulting dress. I touched the flawless diamonds resting heavily against my collarbone. The executioner had returned. "It is time," Elijah said, picking up Malik and resting the boy effortlessly against his hip. "Let's go to church." We walked out of the suite together. We descended the grand, curving staircase of the Pierce estate as a unified, impenetrable front. Waiting for us at the base of the stone steps was a gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its engine purring like a caged predator in the cool evening air. The driver opened the heavy armored door. I climbed into the pristine leather interior, followed by the two most important men in my life. I looked out the tinted window as the luxury vehicle glided smoothly through the wrought iron gates of the estate, heading straight for the glittering lights of the city. We were not just attending a 40th anniversary gala, we were bringing the reckoning. The drive to the church was a masterclass in silent anticipation. The tension inside the Rolls-Royce was not born of fear, but of absolute, focused certainty. Elijah held my hand, his thumb tracing the heavy band of the diamond ring. He had already signaled his lead security director to discreetly escort Malik through a private side entrance to our reserved table, ensuring the child was completely shielded from the impending chaos. Tonight was about dismantling the past, and there was no need for Malik to witness the ugliness of my biological family. As we pulled up to the grand entrance of the church, the sheer scale of the hypocrisy was staggering. My father had spared absolutely no expense for his 40th anniversary gala. Valet drivers in crisp white uniforms rushed to open doors for arriving guests. Local society photographers snapped pictures as the city's most influential black elite stepped onto the plush crimson carpet. Mayors, city council members, real estate tycoons, and wealthy business owners moved toward the massive double doors, laughing and holding expensive champagne flutes. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the lavish celebration they were attending was funded by stolen charity money and a desperate collapsing Ponzi scheme. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle. The cool evening air hit my face. I smoothed the cheap gray polyester dress my mother had sent me. Paired with the blinding, flawless pierced diamonds resting heavily against my collarbone, the dull fabric somehow transcended its cheap origins. My posture, my absolute lack of intimidation, and the millions of dollars radiating from my neck turned the insulting garment into an avant-garde statement of power. Elijah stepped out beside me, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. His presence alone causing a ripple of hushed whispers to spread through the crowd of arriving guests. We walked up the stairs and stepped through the heavy oak doors into the grand lobby. The foyer was a sea of silk designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Right at the center of the room, perfectly positioned beneath a massive crystal chandelier, stood my mother and Chloe. Valerie Thomas was holding court wearing a sequined emerald gown, greeting the wealthy donors with her signature practice smile. Chloe stood beside her holding a glass of dark red wine, looking aggressively manicured but distinctly strained. I could see the dark circles poorly hidden beneath her heavy foundation. I could see the frantic, rigid tension in her jaw. She was a woman drowning in debt, trying desperately to maintain the illusion of royalty. As I walked across the marble floor, the crowd naturally parted for Elijah. The hushed whispers grew louder. My mother turned her plastic smile, freezing instantly as her eyes locked onto me. She looked at the gray dress she had sent to humiliate me. Then her gaze traveled upward to the cascading diamonds framing my face. Her brain seemed to completely malfunction, unable to process how her ultimate insult had been transformed into a display of absolute untouchable wealth. Chloe saw me a second later. Her reaction was not shock. It was pure, unadulterated venom. The deep-seated jealousy that had consumed her entire life flared into a blinding rage. She saw me standing tall, commanding the attention of the entire room, wearing jewels that cost more than her entire heavily mortgaged estate. Her rational mind snapped. She gripped her wine glass, her knuckles turning white, and marched directly toward me, cutting through a group of city council members. I stopped walking, letting her approach. I maintained a perfectly serene expression. What do you think you are doing? Chloe hissed, her voice vibrating with malice loudly enough for the surrounding elite guests to hear. You think because you work as a glorified maid for a rich man, you can steal a designer dress and parade around here like you belong. Take off those fake diamonds and go to the back before I have security throw you out. She did not wait for my response. In a swift, vicious motion designed to look like an accidental stumble, she thrust her arm forward, aiming the full glass of dark red wine directly at my chest. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to physically ruin me, to stain me, and force me to run out of the building in shame. She was far too slow. I had spent my entire life anticipating their attacks. I shifted my weight and smoothly pivoted to the right. The dark red liquid flew past my shoulder, completely missing the gray dress. The heavy crystal wine glass slipped from Chloe's hand and shattered violently against the pristine marble floor. The loud crash echoed through the lobby, instantly silencing the jazz quartet. Hundreds of conversations stopped dead. Every single powerful guest in the room turned to stare at the commotion. A few stray drops of the red wine splashed onto the toe of my designer heel. I looked down at the tiny red stains, then back up at Chloe, whose face was now flushed with deep public embarrassment. Before Chloe could attempt to salvage her fabricated accident, a sudden frantic commotion erupted near the coat check. Bradley Vance came tearing through the crowd of elite guests, completely ignoring every standard of social decorum. He looked absolutely unhinged. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled, his tie was pulled loose, and he was sweating so profusely, his hair clung to his forehead. He had clearly been waiting in the lobby, desperate to intercept his only remaining lifeline. He spotted Elijah standing just half a step behind me. Brad's eyes widened in wild, frantic relief. He lunged forward, literally shoving Chloe aside, causing her to stumble into a floral arrangement. He reached out to grab my shoulder to push me out of the way, so he could grovel directly to the billionaire. "Mr. Pierce!" Brad gasped, his voice cracking, pitching loudly into the silent room. "Mr. Pierce, please. I am Bradley Vance, the audit." It was a massive misunderstanding. The funds were just reallocated. I can explain the portfolio. I just need 5 minutes of your time to clear this up. We can still make the partnership work. Brad stood there, his hand outstretched, panting heavily, begging for his financial life in front of the entire congregation and the city's most influential leaders. He was a cornered animal, completely stripping away his own dignity. Elijah did not flinch. He did not blink. He looked at Brad with the cold, empty detachment of a man observing an insect on the pavement. He did not acknowledge Brad's words. He did not acknowledge Brad's existence. Instead, Elijah Pierce, the most powerful financial titan in the city, stepped smoothly past the sweating, frantic man. He reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a pristine white silk handkerchief. He moved with deliberate, unhurried grace, completely commanding the silent room. He stopped directly in front of me. Slowly, he lowered himself, dropping to one knee right there on the wine-stained marble floor. A collective audible gasp swept through the hundreds of guests. My mother raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Chloe stared in paralyzed disbelief. Brad froze, his outstretched hand dropping limply to his side, his mind entirely unable to process what was happening. Elijah ignored them all. He gently took hold of my ankle, stabilizing my foot. With meticulous, respectful care, he used the silk handkerchief to wipe the few drops of spilled red wine from my shoe. It was a gesture of absolute supreme devotion. It was a public, undeniable declaration of my worth. By kneeling before me to clean my shoe, Elijah systematically destroyed every lie my family had ever told about me. He elevated me above every single person in that room, and simultaneously reduced Brad and Chloe to utter insignificance. He finished wiping the leather, folded the stained silk, and placed it back into his pocket. He stood up seamlessly, towering over Brad. He offered his arm to me, his eyes completely focused on mine. "Shall we proceed to our table, senior partner?" Elijah asked, his voice carrying effortlessly across the dead silent lobby. I smiled, placing my hand on his arm. "We certainly shall," I replied. "Certainly." We walked forward as a single impenetrable unit. The crowd physically parted for us, creating a wide path through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. We stepped around the shattered crystal and the spilled wine, leaving the stain behind us. But Bradley Vance was not a man who understood when he had been utterly defeated. He was a man drowning in his own catastrophic failures, desperately grasping at any illusion of control. He could not compute that Elijah Pierce, a titan of industry, was deferring to me. In Brad's narrow, arrogant mind, I was still the outcast. I was still the scapegoat. I was still the woman who could be pushed aside. Brad scrambled to block our path. He puffed out his chest, trying to project a dominance he absolutely did not possess. He looked at me with a mixture of panic and deep-seated condescension. "Zuri, step aside." Brad ordered, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "Go wait by the coat check. This is business for real men. This is corporate maneuvering. You have no place here. Let the adults speak." Elijah stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his posture. He simply looked at Brad with a gaze so lethal it seemed to drop the temperature of the entire grand lobby to absolute zero. "Are you giving orders to the senior partner who holds 40% of my private acquisitions?" Elijah asked, his words cutting through the dead silent room like a serrated blade. "Are you giving orders to my fiancé?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was deafening. It was the sound of a reality completely violently realigning. Brad stumbled backward. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own execution order. A few feet away, Chloe gasped. The fresh glass of expensive champagne she had just grabbed from a passing tray slipped right through her trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor. It shattered. Another sharp, violent crash of breaking glass echoing her completely breaking reality. My mother, Valerie Thomas, watched her golden son-in-law crumble. She watched her favored daughter stand paralyzed in a puddle of expensive champagne. She saw the empire she had built on lies and stolen charity funds evaporating into dust. She saw the absolute unyielding power I now held. She did what every manipulative predator does when they are hopelessly cornered. She changed her mask. Valerie smoothed the sequins on her emerald gown. She forced her facial muscles to relax. She plastered on a smile of pure, sickeningly sweet maternal affection. She transitioned instantly from the cruel matriarch who had sent me a servant's dress to the loving grandmother welcoming her family home. "Zuri, my beautiful girl," Valerie cooed, her voice echoing with artificial syrupy warmth. She stepped forward, holding her arms open wide, acting as if the hostility of the last 30 years had never existed. "And who is this handsome little boy? Is this my new grandson? We are family, Zuri. Family forgives. Family stays together. Come give your mother a hug." She reached out her manicured hands, stretching toward Malik, trying to touch him, trying to pull us into her twisted, toxic narrative of family unity in front of the watching elite. I stepped firmly in front of Elijah and Malik, creating a physical barrier she would never be allowed to cross. "Do not reach for my son," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying to the furthest corners of the silent hall. "Do not call him your grandson. Do not call me your daughter." Valerie froze, her arms suspended in midair, her fake smile trembling at the edges. I unclasped my silver clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the crisp, heavily embossed legal documents. I held them up. "You smiled when you stole from your own congregation. You smiled when you diverted funds from the orphanage to pay for your designer clothes. You smiled when you threw me out into the street," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. I held up the primary deed to the sprawling Buckhead estate. "You sold your soul for a mansion you do not even own. I own it." I held up the aggressive commercial paper outlining Brad's massive toxic debts. I looked directly at Brad, who was still trembling. "I own him." I turned my gaze back to my mother, watching the fake loving grandmother mask completely melt away, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "You wanted me to wear the dress of a servant. You wanted me to hide in the shadows. You wanted me to be nothing," I said, the repetition of the words driving the final nails into her social coffin. But I am the landlord. I am the bank. I am the end of the Thomas legacy. The absolute finality of my words hung in the heavy air. I watched the realization hit them. I watched the denial fight the brutal truth. I watched their minds fracture under the crushing weight of their own consequences. Brad Vance refused to accept it. He refused to be owned by the woman he had spent years mocking. He refused to submit to the family outcast. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon a masculine authority he had long since forfeited. He stepped around the shattered crystal on the floor. He stepped closer to Elijah, completely ignoring my presence. "Zuri, step back," Brad commanded. His voice was loud. His voice was desperately trying to sound in control. His voice was a hollow echo in a cavernous room. "Go wait by the coat check. This is corporate maneuvering. This is high-level finance. This is business for real men." Elijah did not move. Elijah did not blink. Elijah simply adjusted his stance, pulling me slightly closer to his side. The temperature in the lobby dropped. The atmosphere turned instantly lethal. "Are you attempting to dismiss the woman who orchestrated your financial ruin?" Elijah asked, his tone deathly quiet and deathly precise. "Are you giving orders to the senior executive holding 40% of my private equity?" Elijah took one single terrifying step forward. "Are you giving orders to my fiancé?" The entire grand hall stopped breathing. The silence was absolute. The silence was suffocating. The silence was the sound of Brad's entire world collapsing into dust. Brad stumbled backward. The blood drained entirely from his face. His arrogant posture crumbled into terrified submission. He looked at the massive diamond on my finger. He looked at the certified legal documents in my hand. He looked at the absolute unyielding devotion in Elijah's eyes. Beside him, Chloe let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her knees buckled. Her perfectly manicured hands went limp. The fresh glass of champagne she had just grabbed from a passing waiter slipped right through her trembling fingers. It hit the marble. It shattered into 100 pieces. It mirrored her fractured reality. She sank against a marble pillar, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled liquor. My mother watched her golden child fall. My mother watched her golden son-in-law cower. My mother realized the war was lost, so she immediately tried to change the battlefield. Valerie Thomas was a chameleon of survival. She was a predator who knew exactly how to wear the skin of a saint. She saw Elijah's protective stance over the little boy holding my hand. She saw the wealth. She saw the power. She saw an opportunity to rewrite the narrative and save her public image. Valerie rushed forward, her arms outstretched, her face twisted into a mask of overwhelming maternal joy. She bypassed me completely. She bypassed Elijah. She lunged directly toward Malik. "Oh, my precious boy," Valerie cried out, her voice pitching into a theatrical, sickeningly sweet register. "My beautiful, beautiful grandson. Come to your grandmother. Let me hold you. Family is everything. Family heals everything." Malik froze. The terrified, hunted look returned to his dark eyes. He did not see a loving grandmother. He saw a stranger with frantic eyes and grasping hands. He saw a threat. He recoiled violently. He let go of Elijah's hand and scrambled behind my legs, burying his face in the fabric of my dress, his small body trembling against my calves. I did not hesitate. I did not retreat. I stepped forward, forming an impenetrable human shield between my son and the woman who had birthed me. "Do not touch him," I said. My voice was not loud. My voice was a blade. My voice was a definitive, unbreakable boundary. Valerie stopped, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air. "Zuri, please. I am his grandmother. I have a right to embrace my own blood. I have a right to love him." I stared into her calculating eyes. I let the heavy silence stretch. I let the surrounding crowd of church elders, deacons, and elite parishioners lean in closer to hear every single word. "Did you forget, Mother?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet foyer. "Did you forget your own words? Did you forget your own commands?" I pointed down at the terrified child hiding behind me. "This is the child you refused to let into your home. This is the child you called a disgusting liability. This is the wandering, deaf-mute street rat you explicitly ordered me to throw back out onto the pavement. The collective gasp from the crowd was louder this time. It was a wave of pure, unfiltered shock. I did not stop. I used the repetition of her sins to hammer the truth into the very foundation of her mega-church empire. You told me to abandon him. You told me he was a stain on your holy reputation. You told me to leave a traumatized, bleeding child in the cold because he did not fit into your perfect, affluent aesthetic. The whispers began immediately. The whispers were harsh. The whispers were unforgiving. A pastor's wife turning away an orphan, a prominent city councilwoman muttered to her husband, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. She told her own daughter to put a vulnerable child on the street. A senior deacon whispered, his face tight with disgust. She did this while standing on the pulpit demanding our tithes for the Youth Outreach Fund. The murmurs grew into a low, angry roar. The wealthy congregation, the very people Valerie had spent decades manipulating and impressing, were now looking at her with absolute revulsion. The holy facade was entirely stripped away. The charitable, pious matriarch was publicly exposed as a ruthless, heartless hypocrite. Valerie looked around wildly. She saw the absolute disgust in the eyes of her peers. She saw the harsh judgment from her wealthy donors. She saw the empire of lies burning to the ground right in front of her. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to spin another elaborate lie, to play the victim one last time. They are misunderstanding. Zuri Valerie pleaded, her voice shaking with genuine panic now. You are twisting my words. You are making me look like a monster in front of our community. I do not have to make you look like a monster, I replied, holding her gaze with absolute unyielding calm. I just had to turn on the lights. I just had to show them the truth. I just had to let them see you exactly as you are. The harsh murmurs of the congregation were a physical pressure in the room beating against Valerie Thomas's crumbling facade. She was trapped in the glare of the grand lobby, surrounded by the very people she had spent 40 years manipulating. But before the murmurs could escalate into a riot, Bishop Thomas moved. He was a man who had built an entire career on damage control, on silencing dissent with the boom of his voice and the perceived weight of his authority. He marched directly to the small raised dais positioned at the edge of the lobby, intended for the string quartet. He moved with the practiced urgency of a charismatic leader taking the podium. He grabbed the microphone stand, adjusting it with a sharp, deliberate motion that commanded immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends. Bishop Thomas boomed, his voice echoing through the grand lobby, instantly cutting through the hushed, chaotic whispers. We are experiencing a moment of high emotion tonight. A moment of family turbulence that is unfortunately playing out in public. But I stand before you to assure you that the Thomas family remains united. We are moving forward into our 40th year stronger than ever. He paused, letting his deep, resonant voice settle over the crowd, projecting absolute calm. He gestured toward Elijah, trying to co-opt the billionaire's presence to legitimize his lies. In fact, we are thrilled to announce a preliminary strategic partnership with Pierce Industries. Bishop Thomas declared, his voice projecting the ultimate fake confidence. A partnership that will secure the financial future of this ministry and expand our community outreach for generations to come. My son-in-law, Bradley Vance, has been working tirelessly on this integration. The audacity was staggering. He was actively lying to his entire congregation, using Elijah's presence as a prop to cover up the massive financial crater Brad had dug. He was doubling down on the illusion, completely blind to the reality that I was holding the match. I did not wait for him to finish. I released Malik's hand, gently nodding to Elijah's lead security director, who immediately stepped forward, wrapping a protective physical barrier around the child. Elijah stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on me, a silent, lethal promise of absolute backing. I walked toward the dais. I did not rush. I moved with the fluid, terrifying precision of an apex predator closing in on its prey. The crowd parted for me, their eyes glued to the flawless pierced diamonds resting against my cheap gray dress. I stepped onto the dais right beside my father. He looked at me, his eyes flashing with a desperate, frantic warning, demanding my silence, demanding my submission. He expected the old Zuri to cower, to shrink back into the shadows, to let him control the narrative. I reached out and gripped the microphone stand. I did not pull. I simply looked at him. The executioner had arrived. My father's grip on the microphone faltered. He saw the absolute, unyielding destruction in my eyes. He let go, stepping back completely disarmed by a daughter he no longer recognized. I pulled the microphone toward me. Partnership. I asked, my voice echoing through the grand lobby, sharp, clear, and utterly lethal. A partnership implies equality. A partnership implies mutual benefit. A partnership implies that you have something of value to offer. I looked out at the hundreds of elite guests, the city council members, the wealthy donors, the devoted parishioners who had given their life savings to this corrupt family. There is no partnership, I declared, the words ringing out like a judge reading a final devastating verdict. There is only an aggressive, hostile takeover. And I am the senior executive who orchestrated it. I reached into the pocket of the cheap gray dress my mother had sent me. I pulled out a small black remote. It was the master control for the gala's audiovisual system, connected directly to the massive digital screens flanking the grand lobby. The screens that were supposed to display a touching slideshow of the Thomas family's 40 years of holy service. I pressed the single button. The screens flickered. The soft, warm lighting of the lobby instantly shifted to the harsh, glaring blue-white light of raw digital evidence. The first document to appear on the massive 20-foot screens was a highly classified internal banking ledger. It was Bradley Vance's personal and commercial margin call summary. It was massive. It was catastrophic. The red numbers screamed across the screen, a gaping multi-million-dollar hole in his supposed investment empire. The second document flashed onto the screens before the crowd could even process the first. It was a series of wire transfers. They were routed directly from the retirement accounts of elderly widows within the congregation. They were routed directly from the fixed pension funds of lifelong churchgoers. The destination accounts were explicitly, clearly, and undeniably listed under Brad's personal control. A wave of shock hit the room. It was not a murmur this time. It was a collective physical recoil. Several elderly parishioners in the front row gasped, raising trembling hands to their mouths as they saw their own names, their own life savings displayed on the screen, actively being used to pay off Brad's toxic commercial debts. He did not build an investment firm. I said, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room, perfectly level and devastatingly cold. He built a predatory commercial Ponzi scheme. He used his position as the bishop's son-in-law to host holy financial seminars in your fellowship hall. He used your faith to steal your futures to fund a fake opulent lifestyle he could never afford. I pressed the button again. The screen shifted. It displayed the certified aggressive acquisition documents legally binding and fully executed by Pierce Industries. It displayed the total outright purchase of Brad's toxic debt portfolios. He has nothing left, I stated, looking directly at Brad, who was now trembling violently near the coat check. Pierce Industries owns every single cent of his commercial paper. He is entirely, utterly, and inescapably bankrupt. Brad's entire world shattered in real time. The arrogant facade, the tailored tuxedo, the smug condescension he had weaponized against me for years, it all dissolved into pure primal panic. He looked around wildly. He saw the angry, devastated faces of the investors he had robbed. He saw the absolute ruin displayed on the massive digital screens. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to explain. He broke. Brad spun around his dress shoes, slipping frantically on the marble floor, and bolted toward the main exit. He shoved past a group of stunned city officials, desperately trying to reach the heavy oak doors, trying to escape the reality of his own destruction. He did not make it. As his hand reached for the brass handle, the heavy doors swung open from the outside. 4 men stepped into the lobby, blocking his path completely. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were not guests. They were wearing dark suits, badges prominently displayed on their belts. It was the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. Elijah Pierce did not just buy debt. He ensured the architecture of the fraud was perfectly documented, and handed directly to the authorities the exact second the trap was sprung. Bradley Vance, a senior agent, said, his voice carrying the calm, bored authority of a man executing a routine arrest warrant. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny." Brad froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him entirely pale. He raised his hands slowly, completely surrendering. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his father-in-law. He looked at me standing on the dais, holding the microphone, wearing the cheap gray dress and the flawless pierced diamonds. He looked at the woman he had called a loser, a burden, a pathetic charity case. He saw the executioner, and he finally understood that he had never stood a chance. Two federal agents moved forward, spinning Brad around and securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. The sharp metallic click echoed through the dead silent lobby, cutting through the soft jazz music that had completely stopped playing. Chloe let out a piercing, completely unhinged scream. She scrambled up from the floor where she had been sitting in spilled champagne, her designer gown stained and ruined. She lunged toward the federal agents, her face twisted into a mask of pure denial. "You can't do this!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria, grabbing desperately at the agent's dark suit jacket. "He is the bishop's son-in-law. He is a legitimate investor. You are making a mistake. You are ruining our lives." The agent stepped back smoothly, detaching her grip with practiced professional detachment. "Ma'am, please step back. The evidence is conclusive." Chloe spun around, her wild, frantic eyes locking onto me. She looked at the massive digital screens displaying her husband's complete financial obliteration. She looked at the handcuffs securing his wrists, her rational mind completely fractured. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me. "You did this!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing through the grand lobby, raw and unhinged. "You set him up. You always hated us. You were always jealous of my life. You are a monster, Zuri. You are a disgusting, vindictive monster." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her, standing in her ruined designer gown, screaming at the federal agents while her entire fake existence burned to the ground. I pressed the button on the remote one final time. The massive digital screens shifted again. The banking ledgers disappeared. They were replaced by a single certified legal document. It was the primary deed to the sprawling Buckhead estate, the mansion Chloe used to prove her superiority, the mansion she constantly weaponized against my cramped apartment, the mansion she claimed was the ultimate symbol of her perfect royal life. The document clearly showed the active foreclosure proceedings initiated by the bank. It clearly showed the 120 days of deep critical delinquency, and in bold, black, undeniable ink, it clearly showed the aggressive, absolute buyout of that mortgage by a private holding corporation, a holding corporation legally registered entirely and exclusively in my name. The room went completely silent again. The elite guests stared at the screen, processing the magnitude of the revelation. Chloe's perfect life was a complete illusion. Her mansion was a lie. Her wealth was a mirage built on stolen funds and predatory debt. "I did not set him up, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing through the quiet lobby, perfectly level and devastatingly cold. "I simply stopped paying for your illusions. I simply stopped letting you pretend. You built a castle on a cliff edge. I just let it fall." I looked down at the deed displayed on the screen. "You have 72 hours to vacate my property," I stated, the absolute finality of the words ringing in the air. Chloe stopped screaming. She stared at the massive digital screen, her mouth opening and closing without sound. She looked at the handcuffs on her husband's wrists. She looked at the deed, proving she was entirely, utterly homeless. The reality finally broke through her denial. Her knees buckled again. She collapsed onto the marble floor, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, sobbing hysterically into her hands, a woman who had finally run out of lies. I turned away from my sister. I turned away from the federal agents escorting Brad Vance out of the grand lobby in handcuffs. I turned my attention back to the podium, back to the man who had orchestrated the entire foundational rot of the Thomas family empire. I looked directly at Bishop Thomas. He was standing near the edge of the dais, his charismatic facade completely stripped away. He was sweating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a way to spin the catastrophe. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap was perfectly inescapably set. I adjusted the microphone. I smoothed the gray fabric of my dress. The execution of Bradley Vance was complete. It was time to pull the entire Thomas legacy out by the roots. The lobby was a cathedral of shattered glass and shattered egos. The heavy oak doors had barely closed behind the federal agents dragging Bradley Vance out in handcuffs when the collective gaze of the city's elite snapped back to the dais. They looked at me holding the microphone, and then they looked at Bishop Robert Thomas. The man who had baptized them, married them, and taken their tithes for 40 years was standing at the edge of the stage, completely paralyzed. The booming, charismatic voice that had commanded thousands every Sunday was gone. The immaculate posture of the untouchable religious titan had completely caved in. He was sweating profusely. The heavy stage lights caught the beads of moisture rolling down his forehead and soaking into the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked at the massive digital screens that had just displayed his son-in-law's total annihilation. He looked at his favored daughter sobbing hysterically on the floor. Then he looked at me. He saw the absolute cold void in my eyes. He saw Elijah Pierce standing just a few feet away, an immovable wall of billionaire power shielding my son. My father realized in that exact second that he had no leverage left. His wealth was built on a house of cards, his reputation was bleeding out on the marble floor, and his golden son-in-law was on his way to a federal holding cell. The great Bishop Thomas did the only thing a coward could do when cornered by the truth. He broke. Right there in front of the mayors, the city council members, the real estate tycoons, and the senior deacons of his own megachurch, my father's knees gave out. He dropped to the floor. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the hardwood of the dais echoed through the microphone I was holding, broadcasting his submission to the entire room. "Zuri, please," he gasped. His voice was a pathetic, raspy whisper, but the microphone amplified every single desperate syllable. "Zuri, I am begging you. Do not do this. You have made your point. You have proven your power. Brad is gone. Chloe is ruined. Is that not enough? Please, daughter, keep this between us. Do not destroy the church. Do not destroy my name in front of my congregation." He clasped his hands together in a twisted mockery of prayer, looking up at me from the floor. "Save my face, Zuri. I am your father. I am a man of God. If you do this, the congregation will lose their faith. You will destroy the ministry." I looked down at him. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. "You are not worried about their faith," I replied, my voice echoing evenly across the dead silent lobby. "You are worried about your access to their wallets." Seeing her husband kneeling in disgrace, Valerie Thomas snapped. The terrifying reality of losing her social throne pushed her into a frantic, hysterical rage. She scrambled up the steps of the dais, her emerald gown catching on the edge. She threw herself next to my father, not kneeling, but hovering in a frantic, hunched posture. She decided to play her final desperate card, the ultimate manipulation of a toxic mother. "How dare you!" Valerie screamed, real tears finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. "How dare you stand there and judge us? I gave you life, Zuri. I carried you in my womb for 9 months. I endured the pain of childbirth to bring you into this world. You would not even exist without me. You would be nothing without the breath I gave you." She beat her chest dramatically, playing to the audience, hoping the cultural reverence for motherhood would turn the tide of the crowd's disgust. "I sacrificed my body for you," Valerie sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You owe me your entire existence. You owe us respect. The Bible commands you to honor your father and your mother, and you stand here trying to ruin the very people who fed you, who clothed you, who raised you. You are an ungrateful, unnatural daughter." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if the maternal guilt trip would break my resolve. They waited to see if the conditioning of 30 years would finally make me submit. I did not lower the microphone. I did not blink. You gave me life. I said my words, striking her like physical blows. But you spent the next 30 years trying to make me wish I was dead. You gave me food, but you made me eat it in the shadow of your golden children. You gave me clothes, but you made sure I knew they were rags compared to Chloe's silk. You weaponized my existence. You used the fact that you gave birth to me as a lifelong contract for my emotional slavery. I took a step closer to her, looking down at her tear-stained face. You demand honor? I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that still carried perfectly through the speakers. Honor is earned. You sold your honor the day you looked at my deaf child and told me to throw him out like garbage. I turned my back on her tears. I turned my back on my father's kneeling form. I raised the small black remote in my hand. You want to talk about sacrifices, I said, projecting my voice to the hundreds of shocked parishioners watching from the floor. Let us talk about the sacrifices made by the people in this room. Let us talk about where the tithes went. I pressed the button. The digital screens behind me flashed. The foreclosure deed vanished. In its place, a massive, highly detailed forensic audit report filled the screens. It bore the official seal of Pierce Industries' elite accounting division. I highlighted a specific series of massive withdrawals. The numbers were highlighted in glaring neon red. 2 weeks ago, Bradley Vance's commercial real estate scam required an immediate massive injection of liquid cash to avoid federal detection. I explained, pacing slowly across the dais, my voice commanding the entire room. He was bleeding out. He went to his father-in-law. He went to the great Bishop Thomas begging for salvation. I pointed at the screen. My father did not use his own money. I continued. He did not sell his luxury cars. He did not mortgage this church. Instead, he bypassed the Financial Oversight Committee. He accessed the congregation's restricted emergency accounts. The crowd began to stir. The senior deacons in the front row pushed forward, their faces turning purple with rage. He took $1.5 million, I declared, the number echoing like a gunshot. $1.5 million straight from the Single Mothers Housing Fund. Straight from the Youth Outreach Program. Straight from the very donations given by the poorest members of this congregation who skipped meals to put a $20 bill in the collection plate. I turned back to my father, who was now curled on the floor, weeping into his hands. You stole from the poor to save your arrogant white son-in-law, I said, my voice vibrating with absolute disgust. You stole the widow's mite to fund Bradley Vance's private jets and Chloe's designer wardrobe. You robbed the desperate to protect your own social standing. I looked out at the congregation. You do not deserve to be a pastor. You do not deserve this pulpit. You are a thief hiding behind a clerical collar. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The hushed whispers turned into a deafening roar of absolute outrage. Men and women who had revered my father for decades were now shouting in pure, unfiltered anger. Deacon Miller, a towering man who had served on the church board for 30 years, shoved his way to the front of the crowd. He marched directly to the edge of the dais. He did not look at me. He looked down at the kneeling, weeping bishop. Robert, look at me! Deacon Miller roared, his voice overpowering the ambient noise of the crowd. Look at me right now! My father slowly raised his head, his face a mask of complete devastation. Did you do it? Miller demanded, pointing a massive finger at the digital screens displaying the exact routing numbers and forged authorization signatures. Did you steal the community fund? My father could not speak. He just sobbed, lowering his head back to the floor. It was a complete, undeniable admission of guilt. Deacon Miller turned around, facing the other 6 members of the senior church board who had rushed to the front. They did not need to convene a formal meeting. They did not need to retreat to a boardroom. The betrayal was absolute. The evidence was displayed in 20-foot high-definition text. As the head deacon of this congregation, I call an immediate emergency vote of the senior elders. Miller shouted over the noise of the angry crowd. All in favor of stripping Robert Thomas of his title, his pastoral duties, and his access to this ministry, effective this exact second, raise your hand. Every single elder raised their hand. There was no hesitation. There was no mercy. "It is unanimous," Miller declared, turning back to my father. "You are finished, Robert. You are no longer the bishop of this church. You are nothing but a trespasser in this building." Before my father could even process his immediate termination, the heavy oak doors of the lobby swung open again. The federal agents who had arrested Brad were already gone, but a new group of men entered. They wore dark windbreakers with the letters IRS and FBI printed in stark white lettering on the back. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with a clipboard, walked directly through the parted crowd and stopped at the base of the dais. Robert and Valerie Thomas, the agent, announced, her voice cutting through the remaining chaos. "We have just received the preliminary evidence of massive wire fraud and embezzlement submitted by Pierce Industries' legal division." The agent looked down at her clipboard. "Effective immediately. All of your personal bank accounts, your offshore holdings, your retirement funds, and your physical assets are frozen pending a full federal investigation." My mother screamed. It was not a manipulative cry for sympathy. It was a guttural, terrifying shriek of absolute loss. She clutched her head, her perfect hair unraveling, pulling at the roots as the reality set in. They had no money, they had no church, they had no home. "We are seizing the church's financial records tonight," the federal agent continued, completely ignoring my mother's hysterics. "You are ordered to surrender your passports. You will be receiving formal summons for grand jury proceedings regarding the stolen $1.5 million. Do not attempt to leave the state." I stood on the dais looking down at the ruins of the Thomas family. Brad was in handcuffs. Chloe was homeless and sobbing in a puddle of champagne. My father was stripped of his lifelong title, kneeling on the floor in utter disgrace. My mother was screaming in the center of a frozen financial wasteland. I had not just defeated them. I had completely erased them from the world of power. I turned off the microphone. I dropped the small black remote onto the floor next to my father's trembling hands. I turned my back on them forever and walked down the steps toward Elijah and my son. I stepped down from the raised dais, the solid click of my heels on the hardwood echoing with absolute finality. I did not look back at the ruin I had just engineered. I did not need to. The sounds of destruction were loud enough. The grand lobby of the megachurch, once a monument to my parents' untouchable social power, had transformed entirely into a crime scene. Behind me, the federal agents were already moving with cold mechanical efficiency. I could hear the sharp metallic snap of briefcases opening and the rustle of official documents being seized. The head deacon was shouting orders to the security staff, instructing them to lock down the administrative offices and bar the Thomas family from accessing any church property. The congregation, the hundreds of wealthy donors and devoted followers who had worshipped my father for decades, were now a hostile surrounding wall. Their hushed, reverent whispers had been permanently replaced by shouts of absolute disgust and demands for immediate restitution. I walked past Chloe. She was still sitting on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of her champagne glass. Her designer gown was soaked, her heavy makeup streaked with dark tears. She looked up at me as I passed, but the burning venom that had defined her entire existence was completely gone. Her eyes were vacant, hollow, and filled with the terrifying realization of her new impending reality. With Bradley Vance currently being processed in the back of a federal vehicle and her sprawling estate legally seized by my holding corporation, she had absolutely nothing left. The woman who had spent 30 years mocking my struggles was now facing a future of minimum wage shifts, staggering legal debts, and the absolute complete humiliation of public ruin. She would learn exactly what it meant to survive on the bottom. She would have to work on her hands and knees just to afford a cramped apartment while the entire city watched her fall. I felt no pity. She had built her castle on the bones of my suffering. I simply let the foundation crack. I walked past my mother. Valerie Thomas was no longer screaming. She had collapsed against the base of a marble pillar, her hands covering her face, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. The emerald sequins of her dress caught the flashing blue and red lights of the federal vehicles parked just outside the glass entrance doors. She had played the ultimate card of maternal guilt, screaming about the pain of childbirth and the supposed sacred bond of family. It had failed spectacularly. The crowd had seen through her manipulation. The authorities had seen through her pristine, charitable facade. She was going to lose the country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, and the social adoration she craved more than oxygen. She was going to face a grand jury. She would trade her tailored silk for a standard-issue uniform. The matriarch of the Thomas Empire had been reduced to a weeping, frightened suspect. I kept walking, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my chin high. The sea of outraged guests naturally parted for me. They did not look at me with the old familiar pity. They did not look at me as the tragic outcast of the powerful Thomas family. They looked at me with absolute awe, mixed with a healthy dose of fear. They saw the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt dynasty without raising her voice. I reached the center of the lobby where Elijah was waiting. He had not moved an inch. His tall, imposing frame was a fortress of absolute calm amidst the spiraling chaos of the room. His security detail immediately opened their protective circle, allowing me to step inside. I looked down. Malik was peering around Elijah's leg. His dark eyes darted nervously toward the shouting crowd and the flashing police lights outside. But when he looked up and saw my face, his posture instantly relaxed. The hunted, terrified expression melted away completely. I dropped to one knee, ignoring the cold marble floor. I opened my arms, and Malik ran into them, burying his small face into the curve of my neck. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him incredibly tight, breathing in the scent of his hair. I closed my eyes, letting the intense, protective love I felt for my son ground me. This was the only family that mattered. This small, silent boy was the reason I had survived the darkness. He was the reason I had forged myself into a weapon. I stood up, lifting Malik into my arms. He rested his head against my shoulder, his small arms wrapping securely around my neck. Elijah stepped forward. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask if I had any regrets. He knew me far too well for that. He simply looked at me with an expression of profound, unyielding pride. He reached out his large, warm hand covering mine. He intertwined his fingers with mine, his thumb resting gently against the heavy, flawless diamond on my finger. "It is time to go home," he said, his deep voice a soothing anchor in the storm. We turned toward the massive, heavy oak doors leading out into the cool evening air. We walked forward together as a single, unbreakable unit. The billionaire, the architect, and the child. As we took our first steps away from the center of the lobby, my father's voice tore through the air. It was not the booming, confident voice of Bishop Thomas. It was the raw, cracked scream of a desperate, ruined man who realized his execution was absolute. He had scrambled up from the floor, pushing past a federal agent, desperately trying to reach me. "Zuri," he screamed, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings, cracking with pure, primal terror. "Zuri, please, do not do this. Do not walk away. We are your family. I am your father. Zuri, do not abandon us." His desperate plea hung in the heavy air. The entire lobby went dead silent again, waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if the ingrained biological conditioning would make me pause, waiting to see if I would show even a fraction of mercy to the people who had shown me none. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the glass doors and the freedom waiting just beyond them. I tightened my grip on Elijah's hand. I held Malik closer to my chest. I let the frantic screams of my father fade into irrelevant background noise. He was screaming for a daughter who had died a long time ago. The woman walking out of those doors owed him absolutely nothing. We stepped across the threshold. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the noise, the chaos, and the toxicity of the past 30 years with a solid, deafening thud. The image of the closing oak doors blurs the heavy wood, dissolving into a smooth, seamless cinematic transition. The harsh, glaring lights of the church lobby instantly melt into the warm, golden ambient glow of a quiet, luxurious living room. The camera begins a slow, steady tracking shot, pulling backward through the pristine, beautifully designed space. It reveals the rich textures of a massive cream-colored sectional sofa, the soft glow of a modern fireplace, and the flawless, expensive artwork lining the walls of the Pierce penthouse. The air is quiet. The air is safe. The suffocating tension of the Thomas family is a million miles away. The camera continues to track backward, revealing me sitting perfectly relaxed in the center of the plush sofa. I am no longer wearing the cheap gray polyester dress designed to humiliate me. I am wearing a stunning tailored silk evening gown in deep midnight blue. The flawless pierced diamond catches the warm light of the fire. My posture is not defensive. My posture is absolute serene victory. I look directly into the slowly retreating camera. The corner of my mouth curves upward into a small, peaceful, incredibly dangerous smile. They say the best revenge is living happily. I say, my voice calm, melodic, and carrying the absolute weight of a woman who has completely conquered her demons. They tell you to move on, to let go, to let karma handle the people who destroyed you. They are right, of course. Living well is a beautiful thing. I lean back slightly, crossing my legs, resting my hands gracefully in my lap. But I pause, letting the word hang in the quiet room, tearing down the fake masks, stripping away the illusions, and claiming absolute unyielding justice for yourself with your own two hands. I tilt my head slightly, the smile deepening into something fiercely triumphant. That feels so much sweeter. I look around the beautiful quiet room, taking in the peace I had fought so brutally to secure. I am no longer the scapegoat. I say, my voice dropping to a smooth, powerful whisper. I am no longer the outcast. I am no longer the disowned daughter begging for scraps of affection in the shadows. I am the architect of my own life. I am the master of the game. The camera stops retreating. It holds on my face for one long final second, capturing the absolute serenity of a woman who has burned her past to ashes and built an empire on the ruins. Slowly, the camera begins to pan away. It glides smoothly to the right, moving past the edge of the sofa, tracking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. The warm light of the living room fades as the lens focuses on the expansive, breathtaking view outside. The camera settles on the sprawling, sparkling skyline of the city at night. A million glittering lights stretching out into the infinite darkness, a vast, beautiful empire waiting to be conquered. The city pulses with quiet, electric energy. The image holds on the sparkling horizon for a long, silent beat. Then slowly, gracefully, the screen fades to pitch black.